I found the spot on the map late in the afternoon. The river ran silent between tall pines that rose straight and dark on both sides. The road had narrowed to a dirt path and then faded entirely into mud and grass, but my truck inched forward until it wobbled to a stop on a flat clearing of sand and small pebbles. My friends said it was perfect for fishing and camping. I saw wide bends in the river, deep pools where trout might sleep under mossy rocks. The air smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and water. The sun was low and warm on my back as I started to unload the gear. We set up 2 tents a few yards from the water's edge. The shoreline sloped gently into the river, making a narrow beach. I watched the water flow by in slow ripples, feeling the pull of its current. I pitched my tent, the dark green fabric folding into place with simple snaps. I laid out my sleeping bag and air mattress before turning to help with the camp stove and the fishing gear. My friends worked quietly, each taking a task without fuss. It felt good to breathe the open air after weeks in the city. I lit a small fire in the ring of stones we found and let the flames melt the chill that evening had crept in. The first night, we fished until the sky was a deep velvet. The river made a gentle roar against the rocks. Our lines dipped and flicked, then held still. We caught a few trout, cleaned them by the fire, and ate them with stale bread. There was talk of keeping 1 or 2 fish, but hunger and exhaustion won. Nobody spoke of how far we were from help, or how the nearest town lay over 20 miles back on winding roads. We slept without fear. The tents were close enough to hear each other, but far enough to feel alone. In that silence, I could hear the night breathe. That morning, I woke before dawn to the sound of water and birds. The sky was a bruise of purple and faint gold at the horizon. I crawled out of my tent, stepping onto cold sand. I walked to the riverbank and nearly stumbled over a line of dark shapes. Black trash bags stood in a neat row along the water's edge, their tops tied tight. I held my breath. I thought of some prank or hunters dumping game remains. But the bags were too neat, too purposeful, lined up like markers. I blinked and stepped closer, the ground soft under my boots. There were 8 of them. My heart pounded. I went back to the tent quietly, waking no one. I shook my friend who camped nearest. He muttered and blinked at me. I pointed toward the river without speaking. He rose, rubbing his eyes. Together we crept down, careful not to wake the others. The rest of the group lay in shadow. We reached the bags. The tags felt slick under my fingers. I knelt beside the first bag and tugged gently, tore with a wet sound. I covered my mouth as I saw pale shapes inside. Bones, strangely white against the dark plastic. I staggered back, my stomach twisting. My friend stood frozen. We brushed our hands on our jeans and ran back to the fire. The others stirred, rubbing sleep from their eyes. I could not speak. They asked if I was okay. I shook my head. I watched them rise and gather by the river. The sky was brighter now, a clean blue. They saw the bags and frowned. Nobody moved to open them. The air was thick with a sense of wrongness. One of them said we should call it in. Another said we cared too much about trouble. He would not go near. We argued softly. I thought of crawling back into the tent and pretending nothing had happened. But that was impossible. In the end, we decided to move the bags back into the forest. If someone saw them floating downriver, they might be caught. We worried about police showing up here or some agency with axes and dogs. Nobody wanted to face that. We grabbed sticks and rolled the bags downhill into the thicket. They thumped softly against trees and shrubs. I watched them sink into shadows. We squeezed between pines and came back to camp wordless. For the rest of the day, we fished with heavy hearts. The river looked the same, clear and cold. When I looked across to the far shore, I thought I saw a dark shape where no rock had been. I shook it off. I bundled fish into the cooler and stacked firewood near the pit. Each log felt heavy. The sky dimmed early. Heat left the air in a rush. We sat by the fire and ate canned beans, letting the flames dance between us. Nobody spoke of the bones. I caught one friend staring at the dark line where we had dumped the bags. His face was tight, strained. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw bones flicker like sparks in the firelight. I stared at the tent walls, thinking of small white fragments in black plastic. I wondered what they were from. Human. My mind refused to turn away. If I slept too deeply, what nightmares would come? I rose before my alarm, hands shaking. I packed my sleeping bag and tent stakes and zipped them into their sacks. The others followed, pulling down poles and shaking out dirt. Nobody spoke. I kept my gaze on the ground. We broke camp in silence. The tents were gone, the fire cold. I wrapped my pack straps around my shoulders and hefted it. At the river, I paused. The water rushed by in the same way. I stared at the far shore. No bags. I closed my eyes, took a breath. The group spread out. I was last. I walked into the trees where the black bags had lain. The ground was soft. I found no trace. The forest had swallowed them. I touched a trunk and felt its rough bark. We reached the trucks without incident. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine coughed to life. My friend in the passenger seat looked at me. I gripped the wheel. He shrugged and leaned back. We drove slowly up the rough track. Mud flicked beneath the tires. My heart still pounded. I could not look back. I thought of the bags lying neatly, the bones waiting inside. Days passed. I washed the mud from my hands until they were raw. I tried to erase the image of white bones. I threw myself into work. I fell into a routine of noise and people. But at night, when I closed my eyes, I was back at the river. I heard the water in my dreams. Sometimes I saw a single bone on my pillow. I would jolt awake, gasping for breath. The others said they had nightmares too. We stopped talking about it. A week later, I drove past the ranger station near the trailhead. I saw the sign and my heart thumped. I could not stop. I clenched my fist and turned onto the highway going the other way. There was nothing I could do. If I reported it, they would come with sirens and questions. They would dig up the riverbank. They would find the bones I could not name. They would open a case that might last months. Reports would be written. People would wonder why we did not speak. I did not want that. I did not want bones in a lab, blame and rumor. I told no one. The river remained quiet. The tall pines stood silent guard. I refused to return. Every call to camp again felt hollow. How could I laugh by this river when I knew what lay hidden in its shadows? I let the spot fade from my mind. Yet I could not entirely forget. The bags lined up like markers, waiting. The slit plastic, the exposed bones. Time dulled the edge of memory. I moved on with life. Still, I never said a word to the authorities. Something inside told me that was what they wanted. They wanted fear and papers and questions. They wanted us to become part of the story. I refused. I refused to give it life. So I buried it in my head. Many months later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single page cut from a newspaper. It spoke of a missing person from 2 years before, last seen near this river. They never found a body. Underneath was circled a note. Still looking. My breath caught. I pressed the page to my chest. No name, no date. The edges of the paper were stained brown. Felt like an accusation. I burned the paper in the fireplace that night. I watched the flame swallow it. Ash drifted like snow. My heart eased. The fire crackled and died. I put out the embers. Silence filled the room. I have never returned to that river. I see it sometimes in dreams. I stand on the bank, alone, staring at empty pines. Black bags line the shore. They lie there in silent rows. I want to run forward, tear them open, but I do not move. I watch the wind stir the grass and listen to water slip over stones. And I walk away. I remember the night clear as day, even though it feels like a foggy blur now. Me and my friend Jake had been hiking the Appalachians for a couple of days. We planned a short overnight trip, nothing fancy, just some miles on the trail, a campfire, and sleep under the stars. The forest had been quiet most of the day, the kind of quiet that creeps in when you're deep in the woods and far from roads or towns. The sun was dipping low when we stopped for a break near a little creek, filling our water bottles and snacking on trail mix. As darkness settled, we kept moving, following the trail markers that were just barely visible in the fading light. We had our headlamps, but wanted to save batteries, so we only turned them on when needed. The forest felt thicker as the night grew colder. The usual sounds, crickets, birds, the rustling of small animals, had all but stopped. The air was heavy and still. Suddenly, Jake stopped and pointed ahead. There, just through the trees, I saw a red glow bobbing slowly between the trunks. At first, I thought it was a reflection from something shiny or maybe a flickering light from a campfire someone else had set up. But as we moved closer, it became clear. It was a red lantern swinging gently on a branch or being held by someone. "Looks like another hiker," Jake said quietly. "Maybe we can catch up before it gets too late." We quickened our pace, keeping the lantern light in sight. It was moving slow, almost as if whoever was carrying it was wandering without purpose. But the light never got closer. No matter how fast we walked or how many times we took shortcuts through the underbrush, it stayed just out of reach, bobbing back and forth like it was leading us somewhere. I started feeling uneasy, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a slow-moving hiker ahead. Jake seemed curious, even a bit excited, like we'd find someone else on the trail. We weren't used to seeing other people out here this late. After nearly 20 minutes of following, the red light took a sharp turn off the main trail, disappearing behind a thick patch of oak and pine. Without thinking, Jake moved after it. I hesitated but didn't want to be left alone. We plunged off the trail into the undergrowth. The forest closed in tighter, the trees older and closer together. Branches snagged on our packs, and the ground grew uneven with roots and loose rocks. The red lantern moved deeper into the trees, always just ahead, sometimes dipping out of sight before appearing again. I could hear Jake's breath quicken behind me, matching my own. The light moved through a patch of thick fog that had rolled in quietly with the cooling air. At first, it was just a low mist hovering around the ground, but as we followed, the fog thickened until we could barely see more than 10 feet in front of us. I slowed down, trying to make out landmarks, but there were none. No trail, no markers, just trees fading into white haze. The lantern glowed red like a distant ember, shifting here and there, pulling us further away from any path we knew. "Jake, maybe we should stop," I said, my voice low. "I don't think this is the trail anymore." He didn't answer. The lantern flickered again, and something about the way it moved was wrong. Unnatural, like it wasn't being carried but drifting. My skin crawled, and I felt cold sweat on my neck despite the chill. We stumbled forward, lost among thick trees, rocks, and mud. The fog muffled all sound except the occasional crack of a branch underfoot and our ragged breathing. I tried to call Jake's name, but he was just ahead, following that red light without hesitation. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath and listened. There was a faint sound like a whisper, but it was impossible to make out words. The hairs on my arms stood up. My mind raced with every possible danger. Getting separated, falling, or worse. Then Jake froze too. He turned to me, eyes wide in the fog. I saw his lips move, but no sound came. Then suddenly he blinked and pointed forward, and I looked where he was pointing. There, barely visible, the red light flickered once more before vanishing completely. We stood there, both silent, surrounded by fog that had thickened to a wall. My heart hammered, and my breath came in sharp gasps. The trees seemed endless. The trail was gone. Nothing was familiar. Then it happened. Jake whispered, though his voice was hoarse and barely audible. "You were warned." The words didn't make sense. I looked at him, but he wasn't sure himself. There was no one else out here, no reason for that voice to be there. No way to explain it. We had been so careful, so sure we could follow the path. But the forest had swallowed us whole. We tried to retrace our steps, but nothing matched. Every tree looked the same through the fog. Time lost meaning. Minutes or hours passed, I don't know. The cold seeped deeper. My fingers were numb. I wanted to scream, but only managed a hoarse whisper. Somewhere deep inside, I knew panic wouldn't help. We slowed, took shallow breaths, and tried to remember the sun's last position or any landmark we had seen before the fog. But the memory was blurry. The forest was a maze of white and black trunks, the earth soft and wet beneath our boots. Hours later, though again, time felt like it had stretched forever, we stumbled through a break in the trees. The fog thinned just enough to reveal a faint outline. The main trail. Our legs were shaking, hearts pounding with relief. We collapsed onto the dirt path, silent, afraid to speak. Jake looked over at me, eyes wide with shock, exhaustion, and something else. Fear. Maybe. We didn't say a word about the lantern or the voice. It felt too strange, too unreal to admit out loud. The next morning, when we reached the trailhead in safety, neither of us could explain what had happened. We had no idea how we got lost, how we ended up so far off trail following that light. No other hikers were around, and no one else reported seeing anything unusual. We agreed never to talk about it. The only thing we both remembered clearly was the red lantern, the thick fog, and that voice. Quiet, cold, and impossible to forget. To this day, I'm still not sure if it was a trick of the light, exhaustion playing games with my mind, or something deeper in the forest warning us not to stray. But one thing is certain. Once you lose the trail in those mountains at night, the forest doesn't let you go easily. The sun was already sinking low behind the red rock walls of the canyon by the time I finished setting up my small tent in the dusty clearing. The heat of the desert day still hung heavy in the air, but a cooler breeze was starting to slip through the narrow gorge. I had been looking forward to this solo trip for weeks, a chance to get away from the noise of city life and just be alone with nature. I'd picked this spot carefully, a little-known canyon that cut deep into the desert, with towering cliffs on both sides. It was quiet, remote, and untouched. At least I thought it was. The first evening passed without incident. I made a small campfire, cooked some beans and rice in my mess kit, and sat back on a rock, watching the shadows stretch across the canyon floor. The silence was intense. No cars, no planes, no other people. Just me, the rocks, and the desert. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, almost too quiet to be sure I was hearing anything. A whistle, drifting through the air from somewhere deeper in the canyon. It was a clear, soft whistle with a simple tune, a few notes repeated over and over. The sound echoed off the rocky walls, fading and then returning again like a ghostly song carried by the wind. I listened for a moment, wondering if it was just the wind playing tricks on me, or maybe some animal making a strange call. But it was too deliberate, too steady. The whistle came again, crisp and clear, repeating the same short melody. I tried to ignore it, but it pulled at my attention, hanging in the air like a puzzle I needed to solve. That night, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, the whistle coming and going at intervals. It was strange and a little unsettling, but I told myself it was probably some local hiker or camper whistling to pass the time. After all, I was far from civilization, and people sometimes made odd sounds out here. The next day, I explored more of the canyon, following the dry creek bed as it wound between steep cliffs and twisted through narrow passages. The desert was rugged and beautiful, with strange plants and rock formations casting odd shadows in the midday sun. I found a small pool of water collected in a natural basin, enough to refill my bottle, and a patch of shade where I rested before heading back to camp. As evening fell, the whistle started again. Always the same tune, sharp and clear. This time, it seemed closer, echoing strongly from the cliffs just beyond the campsite. I stood up and scanned the rocky ledges, but saw nothing. No movement, no signs of anyone or anything that could make that sound. Over the next few days, the whistle became a constant companion. Every night, it came at about the same time just after sunset. Sometimes it was faint and far away, other times loud and close, almost as if someone was standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, hidden behind the rocks. I never saw anyone or anything, but the sound was unmistakable. The desert nights were cold, and I found myself waking often, the whistle pulling me out of sleep like a signal I couldn't ignore. It became harder to focus during the days, and I started feeling nervous and jumpy, my senses on edge. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or maybe some distant hiker trying to find their way. On the fourth night, I decided to follow the whistle. I was determined to find the source and put my mind at ease. I left the campfire smoldering and grabbed my flashlight and a light jacket. The moon was just rising, casting a pale glow over the canyon walls. The air was still, except for the occasional rustle of dry brush and the whistle, louder than ever, coming from up the creek bed. I walked slowly, my boots crunching on the dry gravel. The canyon walls rose on either side, close enough to touch, the narrow passage winding ahead like a tunnel. The whistle floated through the air, clear and steady, guiding me deeper into the shadows. It was hypnotic, almost sad, like someone calling out into the night and waiting for an answer that never came. As I moved further in, the canyon grew darker and cooler. The walls towered overhead, blocking out the moonlight. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The whistle echoed again, close now, almost right above me from a ledge far up the cliff. I scanned the rock face with my eyes, but saw only rough stone and shadows. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was thick and heavy. I waited a few minutes, heart pounding in the quiet, then the whistle started again. It was different this time, softer, slower, almost like a sigh. I felt an odd chill run down my spine. Something about the sound didn't feel right. It wasn't playful or friendly. It was desperate, like a cry for help carried on the wind. I turned back toward my camp, the weight of the canyon pressing in around me. When I reached my tent, the whistle was gone. I sat by the dying fire, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. On the 5th day, I met a local while hiking out to resupply. I mentioned the whistle in passing, curious if anyone else had heard it. The man's face darkened. Without much prompting, he told me about the story of the lost whistler, a man who had disappeared years ago while searching for his missing brother in the same canyon. According to the tale, the man had been whistling the same tune all through the night, calling out as he searched, but never returned. He said some people still hear the whistle when they camp alone in the canyon. It wasn't a ghost story, the man explained. It was just that the canyon echoed so well, and sometimes when you're alone out here, your mind plays tricks on you. Maybe some desperate person lost out here long ago, or maybe just the wind singing through the rocks. But the tune stayed the same. That night, armed with that knowledge, I listened to the whistle once more. It sounded just like the story, soft, lonely, echoing through the gorge. But I no longer felt afraid. Instead, I felt something else. A strange connection to whoever had been lost here, to the canyon itself. I packed up my gear the next morning, leaving the place with a new respect for the desert's quiet mysteries. The whistle never left my mind as I drove away, a reminder of how lonely places like this can hold stories that reach out through the night, not with ghosts or fairy tales, but with the lasting mark of real people who once walked these rugged paths. The desert was still, and the canyon silent once more, except, maybe, for that faint tune carried on the wind. I've always liked camping alone, with just my dog for company. There's something about being out in the woods, away from people and noise, that helps me clear my head. This time, I took Jasper, my black lab. He's smart, loyal, and a great watchdog, or so I thought. I found a good spot not far from a small river in a state park. The place wasn't crowded, just a few campers here and there, but far enough apart so it felt private. I set up my tent on a flat patch near some tall pine trees, and not far off, I noticed a big old tree stump with a pile of firewood stacked next to it. It was a natural spot to gather wood, and I figured I'd use the stump as a makeshift table. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and the sun was starting to drop behind the hills. After pitching the tent and getting Jasper settled, I collected some kindling and a few larger logs from around the area. I wanted a good fire going for the night. Jasper followed me closely, his tail wagging, occasionally sniffing around the tree bases. The woods were quiet, except for the sound of the river nearby and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. I started the fire and sat close to it, letting the warmth soak in. Jasper lay down beside me, eyes half closed but alert. I threw a stick a few feet away, and he eagerly fetched it, bringing it back every time with a happy look. It was easy to relax here, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the crackling fire. After a while, I noticed Jasper stiffen. His ears perked up, and he slowly rose to his feet, staring intently at the firewood pile next to the stump. His low growl started, quiet at first, then getting louder. I called his name softly, telling him it was okay, but he didn't budge. The growling grew more urgent. Curious, I put out the stick I was holding and stood up. I walked over to the pile of firewood, trying to see what was making Jasper so uneasy. The pile looked normal, logs stacked carefully, but I saw something moving behind the logs, something small. I leaned in closer, heart beating a little faster, and then I saw it. A pair of eyes, human eyes, blinking slowly from a small dark hole at the base of the tree stump. The stump was hollow, or at least it looked like it. The hole was just big enough for a person's hand or face to fit inside. The eyes blinked again, and I caught the reflection of the firelight in them. They weren't wild or animal eyes, they were human, but the face was too shadowed to see clearly. I stepped back, and Jasper barked sharply, his hackles raised. That's when I heard a faint scraping sound, like someone or something was moving inside the stump. Panic started to rise inside me. I grabbed Jasper's collar and pulled him close, backing away quickly. I didn't want to stick around to find out what or who was inside that crawl space. I ran to my tent, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Jasper stayed close, tense and alert. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it on the stump from a distance. The hole was empty now. No eyes, no movement. The fire had burned down low, but I didn't want to go back to the pile of wood. The rest of the night I stayed awake, flashlight ready and Jasper by my side. The woods felt different, heavier somehow. I kept hearing noises, the wind shifting branches, the river flowing, but every now and then, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement near the stump. Morning finally came, and with it, sunlight that chased the shadows away. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay one more night. I told myself it was probably someone hiding out, maybe a homeless person or a squatter. I didn't want to think about what else it might be. I went home that day but couldn't stop thinking about the eyes in the stump. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The next night, against my better judgment, I went back. I told myself I'd check it out more closely, maybe even clear the area if I had to. Jasper came with me again, though I could tell he wasn't happy about returning. I set up camp again near the same stump. The firewood pile was still there, just like before. I kept an eye on it the whole evening, but nothing happened. Jasper stayed close, but he was quieter this time, just watching me. Around midnight, I woke up because the tent flap was moving. I sat up, reaching for my flashlight, but the beam caught something else first. Jasper wasn't in his bed beside me. I called his name, voice shaking. No response. I zipped up the tent and stepped outside, the air cold and still. I scanned the campsite with my flashlight, calling Jasper again. Nothing. My heart sank. That's when I saw it. Hanging from the edge of the firewood pile was something strange. A necklace made out of small bones. I don't know exactly how many bones there were, maybe a dozen or so, tiny, bleached white, strung on a piece of thin twine. My stomach twisted in fear and disbelief. I searched the area around the stump and the firewood pile but found no sign of Jasper. No tracks, no fur, nothing. Just that necklace. I wanted to scream, cry, and run all at once. I grabbed the necklace carefully, staring at the tiny bones. I didn't want to believe what my mind was starting to imagine, but the truth was clear. Something had taken Jasper. I packed my gear in a rush, my hands trembling. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't sleep that night or the next few. I called the park rangers and local police, but there was no sign of Jasper. No one had seen anything unusual. Weeks passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was living in that stump was still out there. The thought of someone hiding in the woods, living in a hollow tree, was horrifying. The necklace made of bones was a message, or worse, a trophy. I never went back to that campsite. Sometimes at night, I still wake up expecting to hear Jasper's bark or feel him nudge my hand. But he's gone, and I still don't know who those eyes belong to. I remember the trip like it was yesterday, though it was years ago now. It was a cold October in northern Maine, the kind of place where the air always feels sharp and the nights come early and dark. My friends and I had planned a camping trip deep in the woods, far away from roads and any kind of real town. We wanted to get off the grid for a few days, just us, the forest, and the silence. We set up camp near a patch of birch trees, their white bark glowing faintly in the moonlight, the ground covered in fallen yellow leaves that crunched underfoot. The first night was quiet enough, just the usual sounds of the woods. Owls calling, the wind moving through the leaves, distant cracks from branches settling. But on the second night, something started that none of us expected. Around midnight, a soft ringing noise echoed from somewhere in the birch woods. At first, we thought it might be a bird or an animal, but the sound wasn't natural. It was the faint, slow chime of a bell, delicate and rhythmic, like someone was shaking a small bell gently among the trees. None of us moved at first. We just listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't loud, just enough to catch our attention through the quiet night. We looked at each other, uneasy but curious. The forest felt colder, even though the temperature hadn't dropped much, and the moonlight made strange shadows between the thin trunks of the birches. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same soft ringing sound. This time, we were ready. We grabbed our flashlights and quietly slipped out of our tents. I remember the crunch of the dry leaves under our boots, the cold air biting at our faces, and the way the trees looked like pale ghosts in the beam of our lights. We followed the sound slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The bell ringing seemed to come from deeper in the birch grove, a little ways off from our camp. The closer we got, the clearer the sound became, slow, soft, almost like a lullaby played on a small metal bell. Then, there it was, hanging from a low branch on one of the birch trees, a wind chime. But it wasn't made of normal materials. The chime was crafted from small, white bones, each one carefully tied with thin leather straps, clinking against each other with every faint breeze or movement. The bones looked old and brittle, bleached white by time, and they clicked softly in the still air. The whole thing gave off a strange feeling, like it didn't belong in the living forest but had been placed there for a purpose we couldn't understand. I was the one who reached out and grabbed it. It felt cold in my hands, heavier than I thought it would be, and the leather bindings creaked as I held it up to look closer. My friends looked at me like I was crazy, but something about the chime pulled me in. I wanted to take it back to camp. That night, after hanging the bone chime by my tent, the air felt different. The wind died down completely, and the usual forest sounds stopped. There was only the faintest whisper of movement in the trees. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't sleep well. My dreams were full of flickering shadows moving just beyond the edge of the firelight, and I woke up more times than I could count, feeling like I was being watched. The next day, the temperature dropped sharply. The sky was gray and heavy, the clouds hanging low and thick. We stayed around the campfire, trying to keep warm and shrug off the growing unease. But I noticed something strange. The forest around us felt quieter than normal, like it was holding its breath. Even the birds had gone silent. That night, the bell ringing came again. But this time, it wasn't just the sound. I felt it in my bones, a deep cold that seemed to seep through my skin and into my very core. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the forest itself was angry or warning us to leave. I wasn't the only one who felt it. One of my friends, Mark, seemed to grow quieter and more distant as the days passed. He barely spoke, his eyes dark and unfocused. On the third night, Mark disappeared. We woke to find his tent empty, the bone chime gone from where I'd hung it. We searched the forest with flashlights, calling his name into the cold night. There was no answer, only the faint echo of the bell ringing again, somewhere deeper in the woods. 2 days later, we found Mark. He was lying in a frozen field a few miles from camp, naked and stiff from the cold, frostbite covering his hands and feet. His skin was pale and cracked, and his eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky. When we tried to help him, he muttered something over and over. "She walks between the trees." We called for help immediately, The authorities came and took him to a hospital, but Mark never fully recovered. He never explained what happened to him or what he meant by those words. The only thing clear was that the forest had claimed something from him, something that didn't belong to the world we knew. After that, we left. None of us stayed to find out what she was or why the bell rang every night. The forest felt too cold, too empty, and something about those bones hanging in the trees made it clear that some parts of the wilderness are better left alone. We never returned to those birches, and to this day, I don't know if the chime was a warning, a trap, or something else entirely. But every now and then, I can still hear that faint ringing in my mind, a soft, cold sound coming from the depths of the birch woods, telling me to remember that some things in the wild are waiting, watching, and walking just out of sight between the trees.